The last part of the lesson talked a bit about the Eureka functionality, and now we're going to go into it in more detail so you can really understand how it works. And basically, we're going to talk about the Eureka Discovery Service, and you can read more about that in a variety of different places. It's a very powerful service. There's also lots of other discovery services. This is not the only one, but this one works quite nicely with Spring, so that's where we're going to focus on it. So we're going to talk about what Eureka is, and then we're going to talk about how it's integrated into the QuoteServices app case study. Once again, this code is also almost entirely declarative. So there's declarative stuff all over the place. These are boilerplate ways of doing things that you don't have to think a whole lot about once you understand the patterns. So Eureka is a discovery service. Does anybody know why they came up with Eureka, why the name Eureka is there? Do you remember Greek mythology? Was it Archimedes? I think it was Archimedes. And he got in the bathtub and he discovered something about volume displacement. And he said, Eureka. And what did that mean? I have found it. So that's why it's the name for the discovery service. I think what he was doing was figuring out how much was displaced, a body would displace based on its weight or its mass or something like that, if I recall my ancient physics correctly. So that's when you hear discovery, Eureka, it means I have found it. So you're trying to find something. And what we use it for is to enable an API gateway to find and communicate with backend microservices. That's what we're finding. Now, keep in mind, you can do various things with Eureka. So it can be either a client-side discovery service or a server-side discovery service. We're using it for server-side discovery. And what's nice about this is if you configure it under certain ways and means, you don't have to hard code ports or host names. Eureka will do this binding for you, so you don't have to worry about that stuff, which is nice. Some things you typically try to avoid hard coding stuff because you lock yourself into a particular environment, particular configuration. As we talked about in the previous part of the lesson, the Eureka microservice has to start prior to the microservices that use it, including the API gateway. So it needs to start up first, obviously, because once it's up and running, everybody else comes along and registers with it in one way or another in order to get the job done. You can use it for both client and server-side discovery. We're using it for server-side discovery. And what that means is that the various microservices are going to register with Eureka, and then the API gateway is going to use Eureka, in that context, to find the backend services. You can also use it for client-side discovery, where a client could use a discovery service to find things as well. Remember, we're trying to not do that here. We're trying to have the client only talk to one entry point. Of course, if you had a complicated enough client, you could be talking to multiple API gateways, in which case you might, again, want to use Eureka on the client side. But we're using it on the server side. And the nice part about this is everything becomes a black box because clients don't have to know or care how the back-end microservices are actually deployed in the context of the servers themselves. So let's zoom in a bit more about how Eureka works under the hood. So the back-end microservices interact with the Eureka service registry when they start up. So basically what's happening here is that we have the Eureka server running, and then some service which says Eureka client, but it's really a client in the sense that it's a back-end microservice, which is a client to Eureka, although not the ultimate end-user client on the left side of things. It's on the right side. It's registering, so it's registering with Eureka. And then another client, which in this case would be the gateway, API gateway, will discover the existence of the microservice, which is registered, and then we'll go ahead and send the request over to the microservice. It's kind of an obvious pattern, right? There's a great quote that people have said for decades where no problem in computer science is so hard it can't be solved with enough levels of indirection. And this is a classic example of that. This is yet another level of indirection, so you don't have to hard code stuff. You rely on the service, the Eureka server microservice, to do your work of discovery. In our implementation, the gateway, the handy microservice, the zippy microservice, all interact with the Eureka microservice once the system is up and running. So Eureka starts first, then the gateway starts up, and then the microservices start up. And again, that just makes life a lot better to do it that way. The microservice that we use, the Eureka microservice we use for QuoteServices, is also configured declaratively. So we don't have to write a lot of code, which is nice. And we use some annotations to do this. So there is an annotation, just like everything else in Spring. Everything is done through an annotation-like mechanism, which is essentially a form of kind of aspect-oriented programming, if you think about it. It's going to make this Spring Boot app act as a Eureka server. So we say Eureka application, enable Eureka server. And then, of course, we have some YAML files. And in this case, this says this Eureka microservice is running at this port number. So it's going to listen on port 8791. You could pick whatever you want here. You just have to be consistent. And then we're going to say some things about how this particular instance of Eureka should be configured. And so what we're saying here is run on the local host, because I'm just doing this on my laptop, and use IP addresses instead of host names. The reason for that is you don't have to do another level of indirection with domain name service lookup requests. Just have IP addresses put in things, which speeds things up ever so little slightly. And then we also say, don't register this version of Eureka with other versions. You can actually have a hierarchy of name services with Eureka. We don't need to go to that level of complexity, but it exists. And so this is how we say, don't do that. And then the Zippy and Handy microservices also have YAML property files to register themselves with Eureka. And what we do here, as you can see, is we say, I'm the Zippy server, Zippy microservice. My port number is 0. What that is that's a flag to Eureka to say, hey, Eureka, you allocate a port number for me. I'm not going to hard code it, which is nice. And then down here we say, I'm a Eureka client, and this is my name. I'm the Zippy microservice. And then the API gateway, as you might expect, we've already gone over this, but just for completeness, it uses Eureka to locate the other microservices that are encapsulated based on the names using its YAML files. So as you can see here, the API gateway is going to have server-side discovery enabled. So it says, I want to use server-side discovery to do all the things under the hood, and I'm going to use Eureka, and I'm a client of Eureka, and I don't need to participate in the registry itself because I'm not registering myself for lookup. I'm the one who knows how to use Eureka to find all the other services. And then as we saw before, when the requests come in, the gateway transparently forwards the request to the designated microservice based on the information contained in those declaratively specified YAML files. So that's just a quick overview of Eureka. The nice thing about this is, this again is pretty much paint by numbers. You don't have to think a whole heck of a lot about how it works under the hood because it's something that's managed by declarative means as opposed to you having to write a lot of code.